It's been ready before we're ready.
In fact, I mean, you just said your first words live streaming. We have 0 viewers right now, so nobody's looking at this. We can say whatever we want. This is actually our 10th episode, dude. We've been like doing this for
10 weeks.
10 weeks. I mean, it's kind of nuts.
Yeah.
I think it's just almost as high a commitment as I have had for, I mean, wife and family, I suppose. I mean, no, I'm kidding. I have done things for longer.
Wife and family, Euroscopic.
Exactly. No, I mean, it's still a labor of love. So obviously, we're not getting for this. I think it says something about us that we're sitting in Germany speaking English about European politics to an audience we don't have.
I think it says something about us. I'm not sure if it says anything good about us, but
no, I mean, it would just be sort of the beginning of neurological deterioration, which, as a matter of fact, to me, I have very early signs of neurological deterioration. I realized this week that I like Handel arias. I don't like Tchaikovsky yet. Maybe this sounds like too highbrow a joke, but fuck it. I discovered that I really love Handel arias. I have like sort of bits and pieces. I listen to a lot of classical music because it suits me and it puts the children to sleep.
Perfect.
Yeah, I mean, but that's it. I don't know. I mean, do you listen to any classical music?
I do. I'm quite a fan of Mahler, for example. I've gone to the Philharmonie in Berlin a few times and heard a few of his pieces. I've always been a big fan of classical music. I think it probably goes through when I was like a teenager in my filmmaking years. Before I went the journalist route, I thought I was going to go the fictional route into filmmaking, and that got me really into music scores and composers in that regard. And I think through that was like my gateway drug into classical music. And then listening to, for example, The Planets is still one of my favorites.
You should say that, because I actually went into philosophy ultimately, but moved to the US to study filmmaking. Then I discovered that you actually had to work in teams with other people. And at that point I was like, well, fuck it. No way. This is not going to work.
No, better to be a philosopher where you'll make even less money, but at least you can be alone.
Indeed. You don't need to smell anybody. Then I went into journalism. You're constantly smelling people, but that's another story. Anyhow, we cannot extend ourselves forever. Although the problem with life is that apparently you can. We can just do the Rogan thing and have.
Yeah, let's not do the Rogan thing. Rogan, it's like Donald Trump. Only Donald Trump works for Donald Trump. Only Rogan works for Rogan. You can't emulate that.
We come from Latin America. We call that Fidel Castro, right? It was
wonderful. Only Castro is Castro.
Only Castro is Castro. We're not Castro. So
no.
This week.
Yeah, we can't cut this out.
We can't cut this out. So I think that my coughing should become part of like my online persona.
It should be your brand. Yeah.
Brand. Anyhow,
I think if you're going to cough this much, Martin, you should at least start taking up chain smoking.
I thought about it. I mean, I get all the liabilities, but not of the bloody assets. So
yeah, you're doing it wrong.
This week, it's all about Poland. Poland. Always
Polska. I mean, I love Poland. I mean, I know it has a lot of political problems, but my family several generations ago comes from Poland. I've been to the town where the last generation lived before they got on a boat and came to the United States in the 1880s. I have a deep affinity with Poland that's completely separate from whatever political shenanigans are going on in the country. I love the people. I love the food. I love the beer, of course, the vodka. I love the nature. I love how close it is to get to from Berlin. There's lots of things I love about.
We just spent sort of 6 hours in Poland only a week ago, because we're actually only 40 minutes.
Yeah, you can.
I mean, we're really right there. The thing, though, is this is a very strange thing, because I also have actually a very close relationship actually with Poland, almost family. Not my actual family, but sort of about 20 years of very intense relations, particularly with Warsaw. But I like Żubrówka quite a bit. The vodka that has a piece of grass that has been peed upon by.
Yes, of course, by the bison, the wild bison of Poland.
Exactly. But I mean, I must say that I really have no joy in Polish politics, although I think that it might be one of the most interesting sort of laboratories for
It is very interesting. It's such a nationalist government, but also one of the most, at least according to opinion polls, the people are still the most open and favorable towards the European Union.
Which actually has, in a couple of occasions, put the government in a very strange or often quite tough position, because they like to go out and shout, you know, Western values are not bicycles, are not lesbians, are not shish kebab. But then at the same time, you know, the sort of bicycles, lesbians, and shish kebabs from Brussels, Berlin, and Paris are sort of greatly celebrated among the population. So, I mean, they love the money that comes from being part of the project of, you know, lesbian shish kebabs and bicycles. As a matter of fact, I'm saying bicycles because obviously lesbians and gays and sexual minorities are an obvious target, but bicycles are a less obvious target. They have, however, been a target of the Polish right in terms of pointing out the deterioration of manliness in Europe.
Yeah. And not only in Poland, but of course, kind of populist groups and center-right groups all around Europe kind of hold up the bicycle as sort of the end of masculine car culture and
Exactly.
the end of modern industry.
Evolution. I mean, to me, it's very strange because I am the one that sweats on the bicycle. My wife doesn't have one, but it's my wife that actually drives. After my driving license was stolen, I never really bothered to renew it. So, you know.
Masculine, like a masculine concept has nothing to do with one's actual sex. I mean, you can really embrace, a masculine ideal or stereotypes, regardless of who you actually are.
I must say, I mean, I am a conservative. I do see my wife as very feminine, and I see myself as sort of impeccably masculine. I mean, I don't know how many viewers we just lost. When from 0, we just lost 0. So
great.
Statement is quite okay.
Fantastic.
But, I mean, what I would say is that also my general political disposition is that I don't really care much what people do, in so much as, you know, insofar as they don't really dictate what I need to do, or, you know, what my friends need to do, or what my extended family needs to do. And I think that this is kind of the place where a lot of the Polish politics, which is a politics very often of that dictation, very often very oppressive, that has actually taken minority groups, immigrants among them, until, we'll talk about this, but until very recently, African immigrants. Now it has moved on to Ukrainian immigrants, who are also part of the agenda items and targets of the Polish far right. You know, this kind of politics of exclusion that has really built its political identity sort of as a precondition to its national identity, and its national identity around these ideas of sort of, you know, essentially ethno-cultural chauvinism. I fully disapprove of. I find them absolutely egregious. I have no point in contact, and I have nothing good to say about them. What I am interested in, and we have discussed this in previous episodes, is that I think that it's always interesting to try to understand what is that moves voters in the direction of this kind of projects, let's say 70 years after, you know, the worst of nationalism, the most murderous forms of nationalism have actually, you know, issued in concentration camps and deaths and so on. Why is that people actually buy into this kind of projects? I mean, not to say obviously that the PIS is a National Socialist project, although they certainly have a nationalist component and they certainly have socialist components, but I mean, not associated with Nazism. It's this idea of national exclusivity, which is much more difficult to understand as an appeal. And generally, my theory remains that a lot of this has to do with the fact that people are in need, and when they go to the traditional parties, they are very often treated as a bag of deplorables.
Well, I think, I mean, I wouldn't. That's one aspect of how they're mistreated or disrespected, or don't feel like traditional parties represent them anymore. At least there's also just a lack of imagination and a lack of ideas about what liberalism or centrism can offer. I mean, if you look at, I mean, we're talking about Poland because there's so many stories popping up about Poland we're going to get into, but they all lead back to the fact that we have a major national election coming up in Poland in the middle of October. So all these things are about politicking and appealing to constituencies and appealing for votes. I mean, we'll probably touch on this, get into more details later in our talking to each other right now, but the lack of ideas. I mean, when Donald Tusk is the alternative to the PIS party that's been in power, this, as you say, not a national socialist party, but certainly a nationalist and socialist in small letters party, we've been there, done that. And if this is the best that sort of centrism or liberalism or cosmopolitanism sort of can deliver, basically old ideas from the 90s or the early 2000s, which are exactly reasons that there are so many people who are pissed off and feel unrepresented and have moved to these more extreme parties. I mean, I think it's not so much the focus on the populist parties, the far right parties. I think it's very understandable why these parties have kind of popped up over the last decade. It's the failure of imagination and failure of ideas to offer anything new. Instead, you have either a centrist or a liberal party, in the case of Donald Tusk, offering up old ideas, basically saying, vote for me to just prevent worse things from happening. Or you're having centrist parties just trying to emulate or take from the playbook of parties further to the right. So it basically becomes the far right, just in other words or in sheep's clothing. So either way, the issue is not so much about the rise. For me, the issue is not about the rise to the far right. I think it's very understandable why that phenomenon is occurring, why we're seeing it. I think it's more the question of where is this, the liberal project since World War II across the Western world. Where is it? Where are the new ideas? It can't be enough. You're not going to get people to go to the polls to say, polls, no pun intended, the voting booth. It's not a very encouraging message to say, vote for me, we'll bring back the good old days of the 90s. That just doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
No, I think that's true. But I mean, I think that the problem is not only that we have, all of that granted, I think it's a main point that I want to make. I think that the assessment is correct. I think that the further point is that not only we're not going back to the good old days of the 90s, not to mention the 80s, late 80s, when Poland sort of loomed large in all geopolitics of their, position in the border and their marches and Solidarność and the people that were basically at the forefront of bringing down communism. The further problem is that I think that we have 20 years of failure or 30 years of failure of precisely this figure. So, the funny thing about Tusk is that Donald Tusk is really a figure that is kind of the perfect foil, right? Whether he's capable of unifying the opposition or not remains to be seen. I think that at this point it's fairly clear that he's not. Nonetheless, the point is that it is kind of the perfect foil on which the PIS was built.
Yeah.
Right? It was built precisely on the failure of this type of center, like Polish conservatism, to really express conservative ideas in a way that was consistent with the population. So I think that for whatever shenanigans, whatever techniques, whatever method to the madness of the PIS, its relation with Radio Maria and all these sort of very unsavory sort of radical groups across the country, including neo-Nazi groups and anti-Semites of different stripes and whatnots. Besides all of that, the fact is that this is once again the repetition of this sort of political failure at the gates of a crisis that has no other candidates to offer. So
it's really pathetic. It's just, you want to talk about deplorables. It's really the centrist and liberal parties that are deplorable. Like, where are the new ideas? Where is the imagination? Where is something that people can get excited about? That's not just a recycled platform from the past.
Sure enough. Okay, I think that there is a question about excitement. I'll grant you that. But I think that to me, in cases, I know Poland fairly well. I know Germany quite well. I know Italy very well, and so on. And I can tell you that, it is not Rome. It is not Warsaw. It is not, forget Berlin. Let's leave that aside. It's not Munich, not Hamburg. Right? There are people out there that are, as Americans like to put it, are herding. There are people out there without access. So, when you have the Polish government going out and presenting these social programs like Orban is doing of promotion of the family, which essentially you have like a price for every extra kid that you have. These things actually are effective ways not only to mobilize the base, but are also very effective ways to address very specific needs. So the problem is not just the lack of imagination. The problem is not just the lack of new ideas. The problem is the absolute, in my mind at least, is the absolute thorough, consistent, and irredeemable sort of pitch deaf and blindness to the very specific and very clear problems. If you have people that are actually in a situation of need, and you can do nothing, absolutely nothing, in over a 20-year period other than tell them, well, tighten your belts because it's going to get rough. If that's your only solution, then it's obvious that you do not belong in public life. You do not belong in public administration. Now, I think that this does not really address a basic issue with the political formation, which is at the forefront of all of these parties and alignments that are actually occupying those political markets, let's say. They're actually capturing those voters because the old parties had been absolutely incompetent in dealing with them. And when they hear, hey, we're afraid of immigration, hey, we're afraid that, we cannot send our daughters to the schools because we have actually very conservative Muslim families, or, that find this actually problematic, and, whatever it is, when what you have in response is like, well, you're just, a fascist, a Nazi, a racist, a deplorable, then, it's very clear that you're actually just pushing those people into the arms of those parties. The problem is that at the forefront of that, what you have standing are people that actually have a general tendency to like to, purify culture, like sort of reintegrate very old ideas of the greatness of the nation and so on. And not only they take it, as we are just about to discuss, not only they have problems with, real immigrants, they not only have problems with sort of, real sort of, anti-Polish, let's say, sentiment. They also have the tendencies, right-wing parties, I think, across the board, but in this case, the PIS has been at the forefront of this, of producing boogeymen who actually accused of being anti-Polish. I must say, for full disclosure, I have been the target. As I'd been a Deutsche Welle journalist, I gave an interview to a Spanish outlet on anti-Semitism in Poland, and I became the immediate target of the Polish far right. Deutsche Welle underperformed drastically, as I was hoping for some, cover. But the thing ran for like a good 2 or 3 months, with the threats and so on. It was remarkable because I had not really said anything during that period, during that interview, which was actually blaming the Polish nation for anything. I have said,
yeah, but they are so super sensitive. When we saw this with like the concentration camp issue, passing a law about Polish concentration camps, which actually
no
concentration camps. Poles, there were many Poles who were certainly collaborators and friendly to the Nazi regime, or just trying to survive. But they made this whole political to-do out of not calling a Polish concentration camp, but actually you wouldn't call it a Polish concentration camp because it was a Nazi concentration camp in occupied Poland. Nonetheless, it became this big political, scandal where then you had to take sides because, of course, to agree with just the basic historical fact put you on the side of far-right populists and nationalists and revisionists. So, of course, you had to push back and say, well, no, that's a violation of freedom of speech. We can say whatever we want, but actually, it's just historical fact. And that's what's part of the problem with this sort of polarization and the weaponization of national issues.
Right. So, one of the first actually newspapers to get sued was actually an Argentinian newspaper. Very large by Argentine size, but very, very small by, media standards. And they all of a sudden found themselves in front of like an international case, which they hardly could afford. So part of the strategy of the Polish government, and it's a lot of groups associated with the Polish machine, with the Polish right-wing political machine, is essentially lawfare and juridical terror. So, somebody would say, sort of, a Polish concentration camp, and of course, I'm doing that between quotation marks.
Air quotes, or maybe German ones. You can do German ones.
Well, I think that you end up in this game, as you well pointed out, which is, well, there were Nazi concentration camps, but they were
German concentration camps.
Yeah, German concentration camps. It's hard to say, exactly what is the line? So I think that the interesting thing is that in the end, it has nothing really to do with the historical fact. It has nothing to do with the concentration camp. It has little to do, certainly, with Polish participation in that. And it has nothing to do with Polish victimization, those concentration camps, which clearly, I mean, I don't need to tell anybody of the amount of death that the Nazis caused among the Polish population. And in that, I include the Jews, I mean, that were, Polish Jews.
Most people don't know that of the 6 million Jews killed in the Holocaust, 3 million of them were Polish. So 3 million Jews. Or in Poland, I should say.
And probably 3 million non-Jewish Poles, I mean, depending who you ask. I mean, this has actually even affected, obviously, academic discussions. They had been reports, I mean, as a matter of fact, direct reports to me, concerns me directly, of conferences in France in which far-right Poles had barged in because it was being discussed. Papers were being presented about Polish citizens' participation in Jew hunting, or Jew selling, which was a practice in which people would get compensation for denouncing Jews. Right. To mention, I mean, the killing of Jews during pogroms, even all the way to the end of the war, after the Nazis were already gone. So this is the case of, the famous book Neighbors, and much more recent Grabowski's research as well. The point is that I think that the Polish case of the PIS is very, very interesting, because at the core of the EU, you actually have an entire country sort of ruled by, which has actually essentially the nation state power within the European architecture, which is actually capable of silencing sort of journalists, intellectual authors, and so on, just to establish their version of history, which I don't care how close I am to agreeing with their version of history. Of course, I mean, Nazis are the ones that, that set it up. Nazis are the ones that run it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't want this crap enforced by, terrorizing.
This is when you have to, everyone goes to their corners, and you have to take sides, and the facts then don't really matter, because, you don't want to end up siding with the people that you're ideologically, the ones who are historical revisionists. Well,
I would say I'm very happy to tell the PIS that, as a matter of fact, we mostly agree on sort of the articulation of what was the case. We just completely disagree about what is the method of establishing those historical facts and sort of them politically.
And the illiberal means with which historical fact is enforced, or I mean, even enforcing fact is already problematic.
Yeah, it's an absolute outrage. I mean, enforcing a truth. So we need a truth ministerium. We're now playing in Orwell's little game. So this week, as a matter of fact, we had precisely this kind of story yet again from the Polish government. And it was kind of funny, because this time they did not take it sort of against real immigrants, as you said in your very beautifully crafted menu for this week's meal. No, they actually took it, they had a fight with a movie. They had a fight with movie characters. So now you have on one side of the ring, the Polish government. On the other side of the ring, fictional characters.
Yeah, fictional characters, which, based on what I've read, a lot of the government officials in Poland criticizing this film, which we'll get into, haven't even seen it.
Yeah, exactly. So anyway, let's go through this quite quickly. I mean, the basic story is that a film about essentially immigrants in Poland trying to reach Belarusia, a fictional piece, but based on obviously the political.
Well, the other way, stuck in Belarus, trying to get into Poland, based on a true story from what's been happening in the last couple of years, of Belarus. If you take the EU side, basically Belarus weaponizing migration as a tool of war, non-violent war, or guerrilla warfare against the EU by sending migrants from Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, etc. Inviting them in to Belarus and then saying, yes, go across our border into Poland.
Obviously, this story is actually particularly poignant because we are now in a situation, I mean, and Agnieszka Holland, of whom I'll talk in a second, but it's particularly poignant because, this is kind of a mechanics that Europe is setting itself up for not necessarily in Belarus, where there is no relation because of the current war in Ukraine and the relation of Lukashenko with Putin, but most certainly in Tunisia, in Libya, in Turkey, and so on and so forth. So that is this outsourcing of,
Right.
migration control and border control also means that people like Erdogan had essentially their finger in the trigger. They can say, well, if I don't get the money, I'll open the gates, and once again, we'll be sitting in Vienna watching these people sort of watching Syrians kind of parade down the street with beer jugs.
Although in the case of Belarus, when it was really reaching its height, and the EU was accusing Belarus of using migrants as a weapon against the EU to put pressure, internal pressure on put internal pressure on the EU to stoke divisions, political divisions in the EU. We were talking about a few thousand migrants, and so for the EU to make the claim, I have no doubt that Belarus, this was an intentional and strategic move for Belarus to put political pressure and to an effort to create internal divisions within the EU. But for the EU to turn around and say this will break the EU, when they were really talking about a few thousand migrants, that the EU, to take a lovely line from one of our favorite sort of centrist liberals, in America anyway, when they go low, you go high. The EU could have had a different response. This is going back to like 2021, 2022, and saying, okay, so Belarus is sending in, Belarus, this despotic government that has no respect for human rights or democracy, they're sending in migrants. Okay, we'll take them. They could have taken that response. They could have had the humanitarian. They could have fulfilled their own their own so-called liberal values, their own cohesion or adherence to democratic values, and said, okay, it's a few thousand people in a block of 27 countries, of 450 million people, and a GDP that's competes with the United States. A few thousand migrants from Syria and Iraq, whatever, we'll take them. But they didn't do that. Instead, they pushed back, and the European Union literally pushed back. And essentially assumed the very same kind of authoritarian response that a country like Belarus would do in relations to minorities or external forces, external populations, and essentially tried to keep them out.
Sorry, I think you're right. I think that it has to be said, though, that migration is a very hot potato in European politics.
Oh, yeah.
Anybody willing to take the step is also very clearly inviting sort of the far right to actually make their case yet again. Anyway, the point here is that Agnieszka Holland, who some people might remember, I remember because I'm very old, Europe, or Europa, which was a movie about the Nazi period. She made this movie, and the movie basically, which I haven't seen, and I probably will not see because I don't really deal with movies. But the movie apparently is a rather harrowing account of a family moving through Belarus, trying to get into Poland. The Polish government went full out and got into a fight with this woman who is now so Agnieszka Holland is now threatening with suing the Polish government for calling her Nazi or sympathizing with Nazis,
or her film resembling Nazi propaganda during the World War II.
Specifically a case. I mean, I don't know how far this will go, but I think that
it will go until I'll tell you, Martin, it will go until October 15th when there's the election. Yes. So I mean, that's how far these issues will go. It's pure politics, right?
So I mean, I think that this is what is interesting, right? I mean, on the one side, it really just fits into the politicking and sort of the politicking and crap that sort of the political parties across the board. I mean, this is not only Poland, and by no means only the PIS, but it's really this sort of communicational detritus that sort of they produce in order to feed as bread and circus for the people. On the other hand, what you have is something that sort of incrementally in the cultural space and in the sphere, it actually gets taken up. So it's true that politically it might have actually, an expiration date somewhere in October after the Poles wake up in the morning and find out that yet again they have another, 150 years ahead with the PIS. But the fact is that in the cultural space and in the context of a European election in June 2024, which is actually very likely. I mean, everything continues to point and in the direction of actually a right-wing wave coming in. Many of these political issues, if they are politically successful in building the brand of the PIS further and sort of cementing further its power, I think that these are things that are going to be taken up by other actors who, will see with great pleasure the fact that this could be effective ways to build an electorate.
Oh, of course. And what I find ironic in the case of the Polish government, that is very sensitive to issues of the Second World War and the Nazi occupation of Poland, and when it suits their interests, very, very protective of how that gets defined, how it gets used, who gets compared to a Nazi, who gets compared to that time period, and wants to really, protect the status and the specialness of that historical moment. But when it's in their interest, they're happy to compare a filmmaker or her storytelling to the Nazis. So the whole thing is rather disingenuous, even if you want to grant them that maybe the film, and I also have not seen it, I'm only responding to the Polish, the official Polish response to it, responding to the response for as much sense as that makes. Even if you want to grant them that the story is told unfairly and it makes the Poles look bad, which, by the way, the filmmaker denies, but even if you want to grant them that, it still doesn't make them Nazis. It still doesn't make the film Nazi propaganda. And to always it just gets old, when everyone's a Nazi, nobody's a Nazi. And what does that even do to our understanding of history?
Well, I mean, I'm very, very partial to a term that was used, if I'm not mistaken, by Alan Bloom, who's, a Chicago academic, famous for the closing of the American mind. I think it was his line, which might have been Harold Bloom, who had nothing to do with him, or might have been anybody else. I'm old and I don't remember. But the line was basically about the overuse of Hitler and the overuse of Nazism, right. And he called it, argumentum ad Hitlerum. So everything is Hitler. You don't like it, it's just freaking Hitler, right? I mean, if you ever get a chance, Black, when he was in The Daily Show, he has actually a little piece on the use of Goebbels, or as he said, Goebbels, which are in American.
Gerbils.
Exactly, little gerbil. Anyway, so now let's move on to Poland, where a big
let's stay in Poland.
Right. We have not moved. So
we moved from Venice back to Poland, since the film was well received at the Venice Film Festival, and that's where a lot of this controversy, this fake controversy, has sort of surfaced. So we'll go back to the homeland, to the nation of Poland.
Yes, let's return to the territorial plate. So a scandal blew up. What do you know about it?
Which one? I mean, we have a long list. We're talking about we're talking about the visa scandal.
Oh, of course, the visa scandal.
This is so beautiful. This is so beautiful because we have a populist, nationalist, anti-migrant, suspicious of foreigners, specifically foreigners from a particular part of the world, government, and yet now they're being accused of having handed out a couple 100,000 visas and basically a pay-for-play scheme to those very same people applying for work visas, asylum, these kinds of things, and basically making money off of handing out visas to let people into Poland. And it's just a beautiful, it's just a beautiful irony that really one of those times that fact is better than fiction.
I would say that it confirms one of my biggest suspicions and one of my greatest sort of fights with all this nonsense American accounts of identity. I think it shows you very clearly that class completely trumps color, right? Even for
absolutely
shouting Islam and halal and Sharia, and they're coming for our daughters, and what the hell not has the far right in Poland been shouting, but then they found out that they had cash to pay for visas. It's
money talks. Class always beats. It's like rock, paper, scissors. Class beats race, ethnicity every time.
I mean, I think it's in a way it's fantastic. I mean, I tend to think that corruption, is escape valve in places where extreme pressure cannot be released in any other ways. So, I mean, I had a long conversation many years ago with some other idiot from Transparency International here in Berlin, a fine gentleman, by the way. And he was telling me that, he didn't care. Corruption is bad wherever it is. And I said, well, yes, but then had there not been a corrupt Cossack standing at the border, very likely my family would have been, cooked up inside an oven of a German concentration camp in Poland. So obviously, I mean, there is nothing pretty about corruption other than the fact that it actually helps to regulate this kind of things. I think that in this case, it's lovely because it happened to Poland. And I think it's a perfect opportunity for people that were crying and shouting and screaming and vomiting holier than thou and holier than thou and holier than thou and holier than thou. And clearly they show that they're just not.
But to add one layer of holier than thou, of course, the EU, in Brussels, the European Commission is asking for questions from Poland to clarify the situation. Poland has sent a partial letter, a partial response saying this is exaggerated in the media. It was at most a couple hundred people through a external, like a private company that the government was working with. And as soon as they found out that this was happening, they canceled the contracts. And to Poland's credit, this was first uncovered by Poland's own internal anti-corruption bureau. So there is some functionality of rule of law and some functionality of institutions in Poland. Nonetheless, the European Union itself is in hot water, and various member states are in hot water for giving out these so-called golden visas or golden passports for anybody with enough money or enough assets to essentially get permanent residency, if not citizenship, in Malta, in Greece, in Portugal, even in Germany. There's things like, it's a slightly lower caliber, but in Germany you have, the Blaue Karte, which if you are going to create enough jobs and you bring enough capital into the country, you'll basically get permanent residency immediately. Now, of course, you can argue that that's, economic stimulus. It's good for the country. It makes jobs for people living here. So they want to give people who are kind of bringing that kind of clout into the country, they want to give them a leg up. But that's another kind of classism, right? If you have money, if you were a business person, if you're an entrepreneur, well, you can go right to the front of the line because you're bringing in X millions of euros, you're hiring 20, 50, 100 people. Therefore, you can get permanent residency where, your average person, even an educated person, someone with a college education, we're not talking about the dregs of the earth, but if you're not here to essentially stimulate the economy, well, you can get in line like everybody else. So the EU, both as a bloc and in individual nation states, also are dealing with issues of, it might not be corruption or bribery in the purest legal form, but it is a kind of pay for play scheme that the EU is trying to crack down on. But what we're seeing in Poland is it does at least appear in some degree to be a more classic case of corruption.
Yeah, I mean, I think, to me, I think that a bigger question of actually pointing my moral finger and saying, well, these people are doing this and those people are doing that. I think that what is much more interesting is what is that these things do in terms of explanatory frameworks. And that means the point you made it and the point I made it during this conversation is doesn't really matter how far and how long and until when you talk about questions of identity and identity construction. The fact is that even if you're not a Marxist, even if you're not a Hegelian, excuse me for throwing these things out there. I mean,
you are a philosopher after all, so
you can get the kid out of the book, but you cannot get the book out of the kid, I suppose. The point that I want to make is simply that intuitively, I think that we all understand that doesn't really matter because money will grant you access. Even if you are like a completely discriminated community, Black in the US, Turkish in Germany, Jew in Moldova in 1907, immediately after the pogroms, where sort of Moldovans, like Christians, were throwing children out of like balconies, first floor balconies, because they were mostly shtetls, but still balconies. You still, like, money can still find you the way either out of the country or find like some sort of, position. I mean, to me, this was the moment watching O.J. Simpson's trial, which was actually one of my first political memories of life in the US. It happened almost, I think, a year maybe after I arrived or something like that. The end of that trial, to me, was, okay, this is a moment in which Americans will understand that they're not a racially defined nation, but they're a class nation. There is a class struggle here. I was completely wrong about that, like absolutely thoroughly incorrect about what Americans would understand. But I suppose you see my point, right?
Yeah, I mean, and I think intentionally so. It's much easier to talk about racial divisions than class divisions, because class divisions you can do something about politically. You know, you can't change someone's race or someone's ethnicity. You can change someone's place, economic or financial place in the system. But who wants to do that?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that this is something that it cuts. I mean, the explanation cuts in both ways. Like on the one hand, I am absolutely convinced that Americans actually use systematically color in order to cover over class.
Yeah, and we see that also, and that's not just a U.S. phenomenon. You see that in Germany as well, and I think probably other European countries.
To some degree, but I think
to some degree.
But I think that the notion of a non-biological category of social participation in Europe doesn't matter how crazy they are. I mean, you could be in Spain, which is truly like a troglodyte conservative country, even when you go to the left, and you would still have sort of a very sort of intuitive relation with the idea that people are not really defined, I mean, by their race, ethnicity, or religion, which are, you know, metaphysical, essentially, or biological categories for the peoples, at least, right? You cannot stop being Black, or you can not stop being a Jew if Jew is understood as let's say, ethno-religion. But you can stop being poor, as you very nicely point out. And I think this has been a way in which Europe has worked very hard at trying to modulate its actually very ugly old commitments. I think that the US is hopeless, I mean, in this sense. But anyway, we don't need to...
Right, well, because the US has the American dream, where the 99% can become the 1%, which is, of course, a mathematical impossibility.
Indeed. So, I mean, this is anyhow, look, we need to move on. So what I wanted to ask you about, because you are the German expert here in Germany.
Oh, boy. As you can see.
Yeah, I mean, so two things that I wanted to just point out. I mean, we're going to move a little bit from Poland, I'm sorry. Boy,
if we have to
get sued for mixing those two, but we're going to move only 60 kilometers, because actually we're going to move it to Berlin, which is 60 kilometers away from the.
Well, Berlin is just a medium-sized city in Western Poland, so you're basically staying in Poland.
I think that that's actually true, and you can tell by corruption, sort of poor governance, etc. Maybe that will get us sued.
Yeah, but the beer is worse, and I can get better food in Poznan and Warsaw and Wrocław. You know.
I'm a bigger fan of German food than of Polish food, I must say. But we can tell you about this in a minute. What I wanted to ask you about is this, which is all of a sudden the center left has become in Germany anti-migration. I mean, you know.
Yeah. Well. Okay. What a surprise, right? I mean, this goes back to my earlier statement about the lack of imagination.
Just one second. So what happened? What was said?
Well, Steinmeier, President Frank-Walter Steinmeier, went to Italy in sort of a solidarity trip. And the president in Germany doesn't have any real political power. It's more of a figurehead. He's not the head of government, but the head of state, kind of a symbolic, unifying figure of German culture, German society, German politics. And represents Germany on the world stage in a non-political way. Doesn't have any real political power, but can use, his bully pulpit, his soapbox to sort of set policy or kind of guide, express his thoughts. Went to Italy for a solidarity kind of trip to meet his counterpart there in Italy. As we know, Lampedusa, the Italian island that's very close to the coast of North Africa and has been a hotspot for receiving migrants, really like the first destination for so many migrants flowing into Fortress Europe, has really seen thousands of migrants come within a week, within days, completely overwhelming the system. So Frank-Walter Steinmeier went there in solidarity, and he made the statement saying, basically, we're at our limit. We finally need a European solution. Which, if I had a dime over the last decade for every time I've heard we need a European solution, we wouldn't need money for this podcast because we could just personally fund it ourselves. And he said, we're at our limit. We, our towns, our municipalities, our states, we can't take any more. I think that's more of a political statement than a factual physical statement. Germany is a large country with a lot of space and a lot of money and a lot of resources. I think they could do a lot more. And in Germany's defense, Germany has done a lot in terms of course, in 2015, taking in so many migrants from Syria and elsewhere in that region. And of course, then again, at the start of Russia's full-on invasion of Ukraine, taking in 1 million Ukrainians in a very short time. So there is, of course, there is legitimately so a lot of pressure on the system. Nonetheless, a lot of it could be better organized, better funded, and it's not like any of this is new, right? Germany and the European Union have been facing migrants for a variety of reasons from a variety of parts of the world coming into the European Union or looking to get into the European Union for a decade, and they have not, or more than that, really. And they have not sorted it out yet, and it's just kind of becoming unacceptable. I myself am getting tired of hearing refugee crisis, because this is a crisis of European politics. It's not a crisis of the people coming in or looking to come in.
I mean, I have to say that here is my baseline. I don't think that there is any freaking migration crisis. I think that, you have a neo-fascist government sitting in Italy that most of these people have to work with. And they're trying to figure out how to actually steal votes from them in whatever way they can, including sort of joining the ranks in claiming that there's been a disaster. You can go around Germany. I mean, where you really have tension among communities, and they really just cut down sort of ethnic lines in Western Europe. I'll go back to Poland in a minute, because there is a development that I also find kind of delightful. We will talk about Ukraine, but mostly it has been about dark people coming from the south, right? This has been sort of the line. And where really there are points of tension, like France or Belgium, where you really do have very serious issues. These are actually very old communities, and the failure is not a failure of migration, it's a failure of integration, like 25 or 30 years later. The migration that came from the 2015 crisis, which really was a crisis, because you had basically sort of a human catastrophe sort of emerging in Syria out of like complete and thorough American and European, mismanagement of that conflict. That destabilization really brought a crisis, but I am really hard pressed to show where is exactly that things have gone tits up in the sort of American, in the Western European landscape. I mean, what they see are mostly machines that institutionally and governmentally have managed to cope very, very well, unless you're actually at a point of entry like Lampedusa, where you can be obviously overwhelmed. Unless you're actually on the Mediterranean, when you're dealing with people that are actually being brought in by smugglers. But the state inside Germany, inside Sweden, however, what is also true, and I think that this is what I find when you talk about like lack of imagination and lack of a communicative capacity. I mean, this is what we do, right? Media. This is really where I see an absolutely unforgivable failure, which is that what has been, in my mind at least, a complete success. I mean, with obviously, human beings, and with human beings in large groups, you'll have criminals, you'll have all sorts of things. But they have failed miserably at making the case that immigration process was managed in such efficient a manner that now, 10 years later, we can talk about essentially a success. So because the AfD has latched to that in Germany, because Le Pen has latched to that in France, because Vox has built their bullshit-like program on these stories of migrants coming in, raping your daughter, stealing from you, like selling stuff. And, because they have allowed that, now they find themselves in a position in which, well, yes, they have to stand up and say, yeah, I don't like migration either. And all of a sudden, the socialist in Germany, the socialist in France, the socialist in Italy. I mean, everybody has to say, yeah, you're right. I mean, maybe we should find a way to cut down on these people coming in.
Yeah, to your question about why is Frank-Walter Steinmeier, who is officially as president, he is nonpartisan. He does not belong to a party officially as the president, but of course he is a social democrat through and through. And to your point, this is my point about the lack of imagination. No one has the guts to just stand up and say something, interesting, and to oppose the far right rhetoric. to excuse the pun, the alternative in Germany's case, the alternative to the alternative for Germany, the far right party, that you don't have someone saying, actually, this was a success. Actually, this is good for Germany. Actually, this was like, of course, there were problems. We had a lot of difficulties, but we actually, to use Angela Merkel's famous phrase, wir haben das geschafft. We did it, and we're continuing to do it. And the only problems that are there, I shouldn't say the only problems, but most of the problems that are there are not on the demand side. They're not from the migrants coming in. The migrant, who comes to a country except for, rich, well-educated, liberal, Western, Anglo-American kind of so-called expat digital nomads, except for them, who comes to a country and doesn't want to integrate, doesn't want to learn a language, doesn't want to study, doesn't want to get a job? Who does that? Nobody does. Everybody, no one comes to a country and says like, I don't want to do anything. Of course not. Like, it's ridiculous. If you're not getting a job, if you're not learning the language, if you're not integrating into the country, chances are it's because the supply side, the state side, the institution side hasn't provided those opportunities.
Very funny that you mentioned this, because one of the articles that stuck in my mind for like the better part of the last decade and a half was actually an article in Ex-Berliner, which is one of the local hipster like outfits.
Don't get me started on Ex-Berliner, but yeah, go on.
This particular article was some imbecile or other American, if I remember correctly, arguing from the top of his lungs how he was here and he was going to stay here and absolutely refuse to learn German. He would never learn German. And I was just thinking, I mean, as 2015 rolled on and like the migration question came up, imagine that statement, that article being written about Arabic.
Right. And this is to your earlier point about classism versus racism. As it's a completely classist statement, regardless of your actual skin color, because a dark-skinned American can have the same privileges as a light-skinned American because they're from America. This is part of the classism. If you have money, if you're college educated, came from the so-called right country, you can get away with all kinds of crap that would be considered, parallel Gesellschaft, parallel society, would be considered ghettoization for any other kind of community. What's funny about this, talking about classism versus racism, these far right parties, I have experience talking to officials from the AfD, the Alternative for Germany here in Germany, and I think this is probably similar with far right or populist parties elsewhere. Their racism comes out in that they say they hate migrants and they say they hate foreigners, but really what they mean is they don't like the dark-skinned, poorer ones or from poorer parts of the world. They're totally cool with Americans, Canadians, Australians, other maybe Western Europeans. They're fine with that. But actually, if they were really smart, thinking electorally, politically, the people that they don't like just because they're brown are often coming from conservative places in the world that actually ideologically would probably, if you appeal to them correctly, would probably support you. You see this, for example, with Turkish communities in Germany and the Christian Democrats. A lot of Turks, not all, but a lot of Turks vote for the CDU because they're conservative. They're very conservative, regardless of their religion or where they've come from or where their parents or grandparents came from. They're, contrary to the stereotype that, because you're foreign or because you're poor or because of your religion or whatever, there's this idea that therefore you won't vote conservative. Many do. Whereas the so-called good immigrants, like the Americans like me, that the AfD is okay with because I have the right color skin.
Well, not you.
Not me personally, but my sort of profile, the people like me, they won't vote for the AfD. So actually, if the AfD was smart, they would welcome in people from conservative countries, and they would actually dislike the people from the sort of the liberal Western countries that are, quote unquote, too cosmopolitan to ever vote for the far right.
I mean, as American Democrats who were really in love with Hillary Clinton found out, right? About Latinos. It's like, well, I mean, I read actually somebody in the U.S., some or other idiotic left-wing commentator saying, well, Cubans are not really Latinos. In the U.S., it's the Democratic Party who decides who a Latino is, and what quote I'm referring to. No, I think you're completely right. I think the last point I wanted to make about this migration thing, which I think it's going to be sort of growing and getting uglier as we move towards in the
absolutely.
And I'm almost convinced that other than Meloni, that promised that she would finish with the issue, and she has proven that reality has proven her wrong and inept and incompetent at actually dealing with the migration issue, even having to appeal to her European friends who she had disliked for the last 15 years. Other than that, I think that, everybody's pretty much praying that, either Belarusia or Lukashenko or Erdogan in Turkey or somebody will actually open the gates in June possibly, or maybe in May, so as to produce what in the US would be an October surprise. Could be a lovely sort of gift to the far right in a May surprise. Just open the gates. In Tunisia, if you're a very good friend of Meloni, and sort of give a boost to the far right all along sort of the Mediterranean coast, right? I mean,
although of course Tunisia now has €1 billion reason not to do that. So,
well, depending who ends up sitting at the top of the commission, right? I mean, because they could really just always claim, well, we could manage it, and it turns out that their friends end up at the very top of the cake. European cake, because actually there is a boost to the sort of anti-immigration political machine. We have to move on, but I would want to this point, which is it still makes my skin crawl to see feminists praising Meloni, to see Steinmeier, who comes from the center left, going and paying her visits, Rute even, who is center right, but still somebody who should know better, having a date with Meloni in bloody Tunisia. I mean, as Italy is now basically, hunting down gay families, basically putting into doubt, just the list. We need to spend an episode talking about the policies.
Well, European history is littered with centrists and center-right weaponizing and bolstering and excusing really crazy, dangerous far-right parties. So,
well, I will actually add to that list the socialist and centrist,
and the socialists as well, depending on the country you're in. Absolutely.
The acquiescence, this sort of acquiescence and stupid timidity of bastards that could not stand at the right time and say, we have a murderous project here underway, gave us things like Mussolini, gave us things like Hitler, gave us things like Vichy and so on. I mean, Vichy obviously needed the Nazis as well. But anyway, let's leave that one. Let's
leave that at that one, yeah.
We'll come back to this. And I wanted to sort of bring up, we need to talk about Nagorno-Karabakh, at least in passing.
Yeah.
We are
crazy. I get this breaking news, email push oh, we're at war again. There's another war. Great. What? I thought, what's happening? What is happening, Martin?
Yeah.
Or happened?
Basically, there was another sort of burst of violence at the Armenian Azerbaijani border. But as a matter of fact, I mean, Nagorno-Karabakh is a bit of a peninsula, so to say, of Armenian territory, which was captured from Azerbaijan, and it really just sits inside, essentially, Azerbaijani territory. So there is a road, there is a Legion corridor that unites Armenia with this enclave, quite literally an enclave, completely surrounded by Azerbaijani territory, and Azerbaijan essentially just went in and started open fire, demanding basically, surrender from the Armenian or pro-Armenian, essentially, authorities of Nagorno-Karabakh. Which they got. Now, what came after that was, and by the way, the pressure was enormous on the civilian population, who were mainly being targeted by a blockade that sort of stopped all sorts of humanitarian aid. As a matter of fact, I mean, I have heard Ahmed Hikmet, who is one of the advisors to the Azerbaijani government, claiming that this was, of course, misinformation. As a matter of fact, I would like to add to the ad Hitlerum another argument, which is the ad misinformatium, which is everything is misinformation that you don't like, or Hitler, you can choose. So they claim that there was no blockade, that actually trucks were getting through, but we know from all reports and some of our own colleagues that were on the ground that was not happening, that as a matter of fact, these things were not reaching them. And now there is actually a very serious concern of an ethnic cleansing operation against Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh. This is very important because although it might sound to many ears extremely exotic and extremely distant, as it often happens, I find, with Western Europeans, Americans, and Canadians when they talk about the Balkans, it's extremely important because it's actually right in the middle of the sphere of influence of Russia. And these are two powers that were at some point or other, Armenia until very, very recently, on the side of Russia. Russia plays a very ambiguous role here. And it's very interesting because Azerbaijan is a very important energy provider, an energy market sort of provider. So the situation is really quite tense. We are now seeing Armenians, I think this week or next week, Armenians will be actually starting military exercising with the American military, which actually, I think, a very reduced force, but still a very, very significant signal. So we're beginning to see actually a hotspot, a geostrategic hotspot emerging, which for the West could be an asset because it would actually might force Russia to, they have already peacekeepers at the border. Some of them were killed during this confrontation, but it might force Russia to actually deploy resources at a time in which, of course, they're starved for resources in their main war theater, which is Ukraine.
And does my memory serve me correctly that wasn't Azerbaijan one of the countries that the EU scrambled to make a deal with when they cut off gas from Russia, when they stopped taking gas from the Russian gas, they need to substitute it with something. Wasn't Azerbaijan on the list of very cuddly countries that the EU wanted to do a deal with to get gas?
I think Azerbaijan was actually one of the was in the list. I have to admit that I never followed through what kind of exchange was there, but I think that Azerbaijan also is a country that still has sort of a relation of convenience of some sort with Russia. So when actually the confrontation started 2 or 3 years ago, Armenia really expected the Kremlin to side with them and to send weapons, and the Kremlin did not move at all. They actually let Armenians get crushed at the border, which was understood to be a very clear signal of them essentially siding with Baku, siding with Azerbaijan. So, the relation, I think, with Europe, with the US, and with Russia is one that at this point is up for grabs. It's a very, very interesting spot. And for me, at least as of right now, it's very difficult to actually tell exactly what is moving in what direction. But can we move back to Poland?
I would love to move back to Poland. I miss my pierogi. But I mean, there's a direct connection here, of course, because as you said, what's happening in Azerbaijan, Armenia is obviously a human catastrophe. I mean, if there really is ethnic cleansing going on, then there are ethical implications, moral, international law implications. As you once mentioned about, the Balkans, former Yugoslavia in the 90s, how no one could really say the G word because that would prompt Western powers to have to get involved. Of course, Western powers can be very careful about how they frame and talk about what's going on in this region between Azerbaijan and Armenia. But at a geopolitical, geostrategic level, this, of course, connects right back to Ukraine, which, of course, brings us back to Poland. Supposedly, its strongest ally, because the one thing that makes Poland different from other kinds of its sort of European populist, right-wingish brethren is that it's not in the pocket of Russia. In fact, Poland hates Russia for obvious historical reasons. Nonetheless, there are limits to its friendship and its support for Ukraine against Russia. Isn't that right, Martin?
That's right. I mean, I have to say that for a country, not a country, I don't think the country hates Russia. I mean, I know that that's not what you mean, but I think that there is a government,
right, politically,
a political sort of brand out of being anti-Russian. I mean, there is a story of Kaczynski's twin brother, leaders and founders of the PiS, who were actually, who actually died on the way to Katyn to actually commemorate the Russian execution of massive numbers at the end of World War II, of massive numbers of Polish intellectuals, like officers and so on. So I mean, there is all this lore about the Russian murder, but at the very same time, you have to keep in mind, and to me this is actually a fascinating matter, that ideologically, Putin and the PIS are very, very close to each other. So as a matter of fact, I mean, there is a connecting tissue that has been ambiguous, but has been there. And the Italian Rai Due, in the show report, did actually a rather large expose on Malofiev a couple of years ago, very close to being extremely conservative. He was part of a hedge fund, or he has a hedge fund, very powerful, and he also has a foundation that he sort of, put money from the hedge fund, and he just underwrites far-right Christian fundamentalist projects around Europe. One of the places where his money went was actually Poland. So, I mean, Malofiev and the Saint Basil the Great Foundation was involved in Poland, and was involved in Poland not just in sort of random operations, but was involved in promoting anti-gay and anti-trans and anti-Western and anti-liberalization, anti-feminist rhetoric and political programs by people that were very close to the PIS. So, I mean, what is very interesting is that, yes, people go on the stage, much like they do with Brussels, right? They just point the finger, but financially, obviously, they're completely tied to Brussels, and ideologically, they're actually just very close to the kind of fundamentalism of the Russian Orthodox Church. I mean, the Russian Orthodox Church in those particular configurations.
Right, so, and of course, but the history is what probably keeps the Polish political views, the Polish ideology, from aligning with Putinism.
Sure. I mean, I think that this is true. There is a sense in the population that, I think that if you have traveled in any former Soviet country, which had been occupied essentially by, colonial forces of the Muscovite Empire, I mean, there is no better way to put it, as far as I'm concerned. What you will find, I mean, is a very vivid memory of a lot of brutality. Obviously, there is a lot of syncretism as well, because Russian, migrants married into like Lithuanian families or into Polish families. So that element exists, but you can visit the KGB museum in Warsaw, the KGB museum in Vilnius. I have seen the KGB museum in Riga. I have seen it as well. It's very reminiscent of the detention camps in Argentina, which were actually administered by people very close to the American neoliberal project. I mean, they look like twin, evil brothers separated at birth. So I think that kind of memory for a certain generation is very present. I think that Ukraine has actually sparked more of that. Obviously, right now, as I think you were about to tell, the Poles that had been staunch supporters of Ukraine have decided that no more Ukrainian grain gets into Poland. So Ukraine has gone out and has sued, because obviously they have very few lifelines, and the export of grain is a super important sort of source of revenue for Ukraine. So they have gone out. So it's not just Poland, but Poland is actually one of the two main operators here. Hungary also involved in this. So they have gone out and sued Poland. And there has been
at the WTO, we should say, and this has been an escalating conflict, political and economic conflict, since the onset of the full-scale invasion in February 2022, where of course that blocked Ukraine's normal export routes for its grain and other foodstuffs across the sea, which meant the EU, the European Union, said, okay, you can then instead export your grains overland through us. But the problem is Poland, Romania, Hungary, kind of the countries in Eastern Europe around Ukraine, that is very anti-Russian, very happy to support Ukraine, but also would like to make sure its farmers don't go out of business, especially when there are elections to win, when there are voters to attract. Essentially said, well, wait a minute, we're also major grain producers. If we have Ukrainian grain coming into our countries, it's going to destroy or at least damage our own grain output, our own industries. And so they petitioned the EU, these countries, with Poland as leading the way, as you pointed out. They petitioned the EU to basically, stop this and to not have to have Ukrainian grain compete with these individual countries' grain, Poland foremost among them. But that sort of exception to the export rules was ended in September. And now technically Ukraine should be able to export its grain over land routes into the EU and then out to the rest of the world. But Poland and Hungary especially have said, no, you still can't take our grain. You still can't, we still won't take your grain. And that has led to the Ukrainian lawsuit at the World Trade Organization.
I mean, so once again, the economic side of this is sort of large impact for Ukraine, sort of lesser probably impact for the rest of the world, because actually we've been living for about 2 years without essentially Ukrainian grain, which was one of the main components of carbohydrate.
Major. I mean, they help feed the African continent.
Yeah, exactly. But not just that. I mean, in Germany, we had like a massive sort of inflationary spike on wheat-related items.
Oh, I couldn't. I mean, in March, April of 2022, I think if you could find sunflower oil at all, it cost €5 or €6. What used to cost €1.50, or the store brand cost 75 cents. It was impossible to find.
There was a period of weeks in which actually in many places around Berlin, you couldn't find wheat flour at all. I mean,
right. It was like the pandemic all over again.
Right, exactly. So, I mean, that was quite remarkable. But so there is this element, but I think that there is another one going on in Poland, and that is Poland. So what happens is that it turns out that there's been an increasing sentiment of anti-Ukrainianism in Poland that has actually, among other things, spun into actually a political agenda item. So you have a lot of middle class in affluent cities like Warsaw, Krakow, etc., who are now complaining about, unemployed Ukrainians who are up to no good, hanging out in corners and drinking vodka, getting jobs that the Poles cannot get, getting state support that the state cannot get. And I even heard
all the typical tropes, all the usual anti-migrant, anti-foreigner kind of. They're taking our vodka so we can't drink it.
Indeed. So one of the things I actually heard is it was actually said to me that there were a set of complaints about hairdresser appointments. This is not a joke. So hairdresser appointments, one of the complaints was that the Ukrainians were just walking through the door and seeing us like, asylum seekers in precarious conditions. They would be granted things that Poles would never expect for free or would never expect to get easily.
Right.
Now, let's just grant that all of this is essentially, possible. I don't think I would get very worked up by competing for hairdresser appointments, but let's grant all of this. I think that when you begin to see this and you see the emergence of new far right operators, I mean, in Poland now there is a machine called the Confederation, which seems to make the PiS look like, just sort of a progressive dream.
Which is the problem, right? The crazy people suddenly become looking normal, and we just get further and further and further into crazy. And then suddenly we're making deals with the people in the parties that used to be crazy, but now they're considered normal. I mean, this happens. It can really drive you crazy.
There is an extra element, which is not only, I mean, you have sort of crazies that are so crazy that make the former crazies look normal. It's that in order to compete with the new crazy crazies, the old crazy crazies need to become crazy, which means that you have essentially the entire political machine being systematically pulled farther and farther and farther to the right. Now, I have to say that I have no sense of relief in Poland turning their attention sort of exclusionary politics from, poor Syrians escaping Assad to poor Ukrainians trying to save their families from Putin. It doesn't seem to give like the far right of the Polish political system any pause. But I think that it does show you again sort of a failure of the European Union to actually call the shots in terms of where the political conversation should be. And obviously, Poland
again, failure of imagination, failure of new ideas, failure of a communication strategy, as you pointed out earlier, just total communication failure that's just inexcusable. I mean, the far right's, you pick your party, pick your country, the far right's political platform, as abhorrent as it might be, as much as you might disagree with it, it has ideas, it has a communication strategy, and it knows its audience, and it's not afraid to stand up and say something and believe in something. It might be abhorrent, and many people will hate it, but it is something. You can't argue with the fact that it is and it might not even be realistic, right? Like if they actually got into power, the things that they're presenting are totally impossible. I'm not talking about that level yet, but just the fact that they're willing to stand up and say things that they believe at a time when parties are just flailing for talking points is in a certain way, from a communication perspective, at least it's refreshing.
Yes, it is certainly refreshing.
Which is terrifying. Which is of course terrifying.
It's frightening. It's frightening, I think, because the one element that I think underscores a lot of this is that I think we all have at some point or other in our day very ugly thoughts about, somebody or groups or things, but we have a certain capacity to modulate our ugly thoughts.
Right. It's called empathy. It's called empathy.
It's called empathy, but I think that there is also sort of intellectual and emotional resilience, right? I mean, you have a sense of anger because the German state doesn't work appropriately in Berlin. And, this is like sort of the falling down movie paradigm. It's like you're sitting down there in traffic, you hate somebody, but that somebody's just not here. It's the state, it's the apparatus, it's a machine. The guy that is driving next to you looks like somebody that is enforcing that oppression, but he's in the same freaking boat. Nonetheless, there you have the gun, there is the window, you shoot him. So I think that adults learn they used to learn a certain type of resilience, emotional, intellectual resilience, that now in this kind of environment in which completely crazy shit can get vomited out and like sort of becomes echoed in this like, yeah, you know what? Yeah, those Jews, they do have way too much power. Yeah, maybe we shouldn't have Jews. I mean, this kind of like, it's time that somebody says it, right? I mean, it's this sort of tough talking, truth to power.
Yeah.
It creates extremely, extremely unsavory political situations, particularly because there is no imagination, there is no communicative skills, and there are no political skills in the opposition. What we have is an endless field of Hillary Clintons just shouting, deplorable, 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 deplorable.
Yeah.
Extremely, extremely dangerous, I would say.
Yeah, which I mean, the last decade at least, if not longer, has proven correct. And it's only seems to be getting worse, because when your only talking point is vote for me so worse things don't happen, when you have a negative messaging, and I don't mean negative intent in the sense of pessimistic, but negative in the sense of literally negation, right? Don't, or not or against, not what am I for, what am I offering? It's vote for me so the other guy doesn't get in, not vote for me because I will give you X, Y, and Z. That is not a winning platform. And right now, what you see, you've seen this now for years, and this is my problem with Donald Tusk. Like, vote for me, who I've already done to get the thing that you already had, so worse things don't happen. Like, nobody wants to hear that kind of political messaging. That's not a hopeful message of like, well, at least we're not the far right. That's a weak. That's boring.
I think I would say that there is one added danger in that, which is the one that you see now clearly. I mean, you see it in Poland right now with Tusk sort of trying to present himself as a fresh, new, young, cool face.
Right.
But the fact is that you see it much more acutely, I think, in France, where Macron basically won the elections as essentially not being Le Pen, or being the thing that stopped Le Pen.
Right.
Which I think that most of French public, particularly the one that is actually thinking and is attentive, probably knows very well that Macron is the father of Le Pen. Macron's reforms for Hollande and the absolute awful drift of the center left in France towards this hybrid, like sort of insipid crap that, the Tony Blairite, Renzi, Zapatero thing actually is the one that produced a massive political space for somebody like Le Pen. So then you have Macron for 2 terms sitting there, and sure enough, once again, he's like the Le Pen feeder. So I think the problem is not only that they don't have ideas. It's not that you don't want to vote for them, because it's also that many of these people are the very source of the problem. It's how we got there in the first place.
Well, this is the dialectic that, like, the political dialectic that certainly centrist and liberal parties don't want to even acknowledge. They might not even know it exists. They might not even understand the dialectic, but even if they do, they certainly don't want to acknowledge their role in how we got here.
All right. So look, we have to really cut it eventually because we've been on.
We're going to cut it. I think we should just to quickly wrap up the grain dispute. I mean, the grain dispute spilled over into the war because now Poland is saying we're not going to give you any more weapons, which is crazy. But of course, but it's like, I mean, just to quickly wrap this up again, like every time.
Quickly, it's fine. It's fine. We have time.
Every time. Well, I mean, the sun, as you can see, the sun is coming around the building. I got stuff to do on this in this lovely evening. But you know, every time you hold the Polish government to account, say, well, what do you mean by this? Or can you explain this? Or this looks fishy. They always sort of say fake news, media, liberal media, exaggeration. And they're just like we saw with the whole visa scandal. We're seeing this with the weapons, saying, no, we've never said that we're going to stop weapons. We're just not going to give modern weapons to Ukraine, or we're really focusing on making sure our military is equipped, as if it's a zero-sum game where Poland doesn't get weapons so we can have weapons, or that doesn't really make a lot of sense, especially since a lot of the modern weapons that Poland would be getting are getting backfilled from the United States exactly because Poland is giving its weapons to Ukraine. Poland gives its weapons to Ukraine, and more modern weapons get backfilled from the United States into Poland. So that argument doesn't make a lot of sense to me. But the news that broke this week that Poland, staunch supporter of Ukraine, might stop giving weapons to Ukraine was really quite something to read. That said, what they've definitely made clear is that the delivery of weapons through Poland from other countries is not going to be affected.
Right, exactly. But I mean, I think that, so, it is having your cake and eating it too, right? So the internal line is like, well, we're going to stand up to this guys calling us on whatever the grain deal is. By doing that, however, at the same time, we're going to continue supporting them. The fact is that the position is everything that I came to expect from the PiS in the sort of context of geopolitics.
Right.
It's kind of this smarmy, double-meant, sort of double-speak, unclear, we stand. But the fact at the same time...
Populism.
It is populism, agreed, but at the same time, I think it's something that in the context of the current situation, I mean, if you read sort of this war, the way, I read the war at least, and I think that Poland has been actually claiming that they read the war, a war of aggression by a brutal Russian operator, like going into a country in Europe and murdering people. I mean, forget the question of territoriality, just murders and like war crimes. Then the claim that they are not going to give further weapons to Poland to Ukraine is absolutely unconscionable.
Yeah.
Absolutely unconscionable. I mean, you cannot make the case on any moral grounds, and you cannot say anything else after that.
Yeah. It's pretty impressive. I mean, I think both sides seem to be trying to tone down the acrimony, and they say that there's going to be more talks. And again, I think by the October 15th, when Polish elections come around, all this will be solved, or shortly thereafter when the election results come out, because this is all electioneering. And I mean, this is the reality of the world we live in, but it's very sad that, really matters of life and death, like what's happening in Ukraine, is getting put at risk because of domestic politics of a party in Poland.
Indeed. Look, we could talk about things that we're looking at for next week, but let's not. Let's just surprise our audience.
Let's surprise our audience at zero.
Let's just come in and say, like, hey, I am very happy with how this went. I mean, I don't know if anybody watched it at all. I mean, we will find out. But
yeah.
I thought I actually felt I learned a lot from this conversation. I mean,
I liked it a lot. First of all, the delay is better than Skype, so we can have a better conversation.
It's incredible.
Yeah, because before we were talking over each other because there was such a long technical delay.
Right.
There's a less of a delay, so that's one thing. Two, I think this actually saved us more time because then there's none of the editing.
Right.
And three, so what happens now? This will get saved into YouTube as a
for
playback.
live, but it will get saved as a
Okay,
video.
so what I'll do is I'm just going to I'll just take the YouTube link and put it into a Substack post, and that way people can get it that way.
Okay, good. Do you know why blind people don't parachute?
Is this a joke?
I don't
Are
know.
we ending on a joke?
Do you have objections?
To ending on a joke? No.
Okay, so do you know why blind people don't parachute?
No, tell me.
Because it scares the fuck out of the dog. Anyway, I'll talk to you next week.
Have a lovely weekend.
You too.
Bye.